Hello and welcome to Rise of the Data Cloud. Today we're kicking off Season 2, and in our first episode, we're featuring an interview with Frank Slootman, CEO of Snowflake. In this episode, Frank gives us an update on what the last year has looked like for Snowflake, the impacts of their record-setting IPO, the monumental impact of the data cloud, and much more. So please enjoy this conversation between Frank Slootman, CEO of Snowflake, and your host, Steve Hamm.
So Frank, it's been about a year since we started off the podcasts, and yours was the initial one. So a lot has changed. I wanted to talk to you about one of the most important things that's changed, which is you and your leadership team has coined the term data cloud. The idea that data is mass migrating to the cloud, where it can be better integrated, managed, shared, analyzed, all that good stuff. And you positioned Snowflake as the leader in this journey for businesses and organizations. So I wanted to know, how has your vision of the data clouds evolved and developed over the past months?
It's a great question, Steve. Our basic observation about the industry is that infrastructure clouds are, of course, highly scaled and consolidated in the likes of Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, and so on. They're massive and getting bigger. We also have very large application clouds, right? The likes of Salesforce and Workday and ServiceNow and SAP and so on. And that's all good, and customers broadly use these capabilities, and then you go look for data, and it turns out that data is fragmented and segmented in millions and millions of places, behind all kinds of perimeters, network systems, applications, and so on. So, and you wonder why. So data is just taking a back seat to the infrastructure as well as to the applications. And you can ask the question, well, why is this an issue? Why is this a problem? A lot of the analytics efforts that we've had as an industry were very much what we call in silo, meaning that they were targeting one specific data set and using things like Tableau to dashboard that. And people were reasonably happy with those kind of results. But the world is changing, right? Data science really doesn't care, number one, about the boundaries that exist between data silos. They're very much into discovering and describing relationships between data sets that might be, very unlikely, if you will, in the sense that I might relate an internal data set with an external one, structured with unstructured. It's really about understanding data relationships, because once I do, then I can use those relationships to train models on, and then I can use them to predict. And obviously, that's the value that we get from discovering data relationships. But these data relationships cannot be impeded and encumbered by data silos and data living in millions of places. So it's very important that we arrive at a notion of a data cloud where the workloads have unfettered access to data regardless of what it is and where it lives and so on. And we're going to blend it and overlay it and join it to our heart's content so that the data science teams can discover these very high value relationships that are there to be discovered in the data. So that's sort of the whole reason why the notion of a data cloud is essential. We have the technological underpinnings to do it. We do it every day, but it's much bigger than Snowflake. It's something that has to happen in the industry, given how important data science is shaping up for all of us, not just in the world of tech, but in the business world in general.
Yeah. I think you've done a good job of stating the vision and also positioning the company, because I think when people out there in business think about the data cloud, they think of Snowflake, which is a pretty important strategic spot to put yourself in. So well done with that.
This episode is brought to you by Snowflake. Join 50,000 of your peers at Snowflake's annual global user conference, Snowflake Summit, this June 8th through 10th. Hear from Snowflake customers, industry thought leaders, and more about how they bring data together now with the data cloud. Learn more and register at snowflake.com/summit.
Now, you talk with hundreds of customers every year, and I know that this has been a pretty strange year because of COVID, but I imagine you're doing a lot of phone calls and Zoom calls. What are the biggest business trends related to data that you're hearing about from the C-suite?
Well, obviously, people are still incredibly preoccupied with the effects of the pandemic. I had a call earlier this week with the CEO of a very large, pharmaceutical healthcare company, and they were talking about how overnight when the pandemic hit, that the demand coming from hospitals was all over the map. It was up 30% here, it was down 30% there. So managing a supply chain and shipping things just became almost impossible. It was just frantically calling around trying to get a grasp on a rapidly evolving situation. That was the first time where people started to realize this. We can't do things based on historical trends anymore because the trends are all broken. We can't steer the ship by its wake, right? We need to understand the relationships and then use those relationships to predict. And one of the data sets on our Snowflake data marketplace is called Star Schema. It's essentially a real-time COVID incident fatality. Very detailed data set that's very, very widely used by our customers because they're using it to figure out where the disruptions are, both to the positive and to the negative. So there's this incredible awareness that anecdotal observation isn't going to cut it when you have dislocations of this sort of magnitude. So that definitely has been a catalyst in all our conversations. The notion of a data cloud is kind of fun because we always talk to large enterprises about them having their own data cloud, their own branded institutional enterprise data cloud, where their unique data architecture, their data sources, how they provide data, as well as how they consume data from the outside, how that comes together, because data clouds become the beating heart of the modern enterprise, right? So we need to start evolving towards an infrastructure like that. So we enable really our future that way. We talk a lot about optionality, which means it's very hard to know what we're going to need, but we got to architect ourselves in such a way that we have an enormous amount of flexibility to move in every direction, as the world sort of unfolds in front of us.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Hey, I wonder, obviously there are huge changes in the way people see data and use it internally and then with partners. Is it changing business in kind of beyond the data? For instance, are companies you talked about supply chains. Are companies really starting to think about, hey, we should have redundant supply chains and maybe we should have suppliers from our continent and things like that? Are they rethinking things pretty fundamentally, or is it pretty much just we're going to manage it better the way it is?
It's really changing in terms of latency, in terms of how fast things arrive and how fast systems react to events that are discovered in the data. Historically, what we've done is we run batch processes. You kind of shiver just hearing the word batch, right? This dates us back to the 1970s. But that's still how things work in a lot of places where we run in these massive processes. And in a matter of weeks, the dashboards are populated and we have nice visualizations and all that sort of thing. But fundamentally, data is being used to inform people. And what these people do after that is unknown, if anything, right? I call it so last century, that whole mentality about doing things from reporting to dashboarding, of course, where it's all moving. And we've heard the term digital transformation probably one too many times because everybody uses it to describe just about anything that's going on. But to us, it means is running end-to-end digital processes fully disintermediated from human intervention. And they run at light speed. They are completely data-driven. They're incredibly highly scaled. They're very economically, and they're incredibly precise. And that obviously is how modern enterprises are really instrumenting and building themselves, right? They start from the ground up by running themselves end-to-end digital. That is the big trend. That is the big change. And, for people who have historically grown up with the more traditional reporting, dashboarding attitude towards data, they're trying to change, and they're trying to build data science teams, and they're trying to put in place data platforms like Snowflake and really catch up and evolve to that level of sophistication. And it's a big change. It's a huge change.
Yeah. And it sounds like that change in the availability of data and insights really lets the whole business just be more flexible, because there was a lot of inflexibility in business supply chains and relationships and stuff like that in the past. But it sounds like this is the tool that opens it up to being a much more flexible environment.
Yeah, we have this term, Steve, the time value of data. And everybody knows about the time value of money, but we sort of created a derivative of that. The time value of data changes a lot. When data arrives in seconds and minutes versus in days and weeks, what does that change in terms of what now becomes possible? Because as data ages, it rapidly loses its value and its impactfulness. And one of the big things that we're seeing at Snowflake is that because people are able to provision so many concurrent workloads with such enormous size clusters, that data is showing up in seconds and minutes, and all of a sudden sort of exploding people's heads like, what can we do with this? And right now we're in a situation where we're only limited by people's imagination and their budgets, because the technology is not going to hold you back anymore. And that's an enormous change from where we historically have been.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Now, Snowflake went public over the summer. Remember that?
I do.
And it ended up being the most successful software industry IPO ever, I believe. Now, how has being a public company changed the demands on the organization and on your leadership group? I mean, you talk about mobilizing data. Do you have to do that like in new or different ways than when you were a private company?
Well, one of the big things you have to do as a public company is that you have to guide the financial markets. In other words, you provide guidance on what you're going to do for the quarter and what you're going to do for the year. And depending on what kind of business model you have, that can be incredibly challenging or it can be relatively straightforward. Because we have a very new business model, which is based on consumption actually equals revenue in our world. It's a one-to-one relationship. We have to guide markets on things that haven't happened yet. In other words, how do we know what our customers are going to consume in terms of Snowflake for the period that we are just about to give guidance for, right? That's because what do we know about their priorities, their intentions, and so on? So we make heavy use of Snowflake itself, and we build very sophisticated machine learning models to reference historical data and patterns to allow us to tell the markets, this is where we believe we will end up for the period. And, prior to going public, we actually spent the year before actually giving ourselves mock guidance just to see how we were doing on running these very sophisticated models. And that's worked out really well for us. We're quite precise guiding the markets on where we are in consumption and revenue. But that's a good example of something that is completely different from what we had to do when we were private.
So, Frank, I understand that one of the top priorities post-IPO is that Snowflake is really reorienting itself and going vertical. Can you talk about how the data cloud is helping healthcare and finance and some of these other organizations or other industries change the way they do business?
Yeah, the drive towards much stronger vertical market orientation was not so much triggered by the IPO. It was really triggered by our orientation towards very large institutions and enterprises. And the reason is when you get high up in large institutions, they don't want to hear about architectural distinction and why you can run this workload so much faster. They want to know how you change their lives in terms of business outcomes, customer experience, whatever it is that matters to that organization. And those end up being very industry specific conversations. Whether you're talking to a bank or a hospital is a completely different conversation. And customers really demand that we step into their world as opposed to we make them step into ours. That's been a big pivot. It's very important when we have conversations with customers that they always have an industry context. They're not interested in sort of high level, abstract, conceptual conversations. We have to bring it down to the relevant industry context of the conversation. We're talking to a big bank, and we talk about the Snowflake data marketplace. We specifically talk about listings and data providers like S&P, like FactSet, because that is the type of data that they use. And then, of course, what they want to know is, well, what are other people doing with Snowflake that I should be interested in? So those conversations have a lot of traction, and that's really the evolution. And for us as an organization, that means that we have to learn industries and we have to learn it fast. And I'm personally very engaged in really accelerating and being a catalyst for making sure that we become really good industry partners to our customers, that they feel like, yeah, you guys know a lot. You know a lot about my industry, a lot about what's going on in other institutions. And that is helpful and that is productive for me. So that's the evolution. Like I said, it's driven by us being in larger institutions and higher up in the tree, if you will, because that's the type of conversation you want to have with us.
Yeah, it looks like you also have to up-level who you talk to in those organizations. You're going from the technology leaders to the business leaders, or maybe a combination of the two. But you're definitely talking to the business leaders these days, which means you're getting more and more strategic, I would think.
That is absolutely true. We used to reach for CTOs, chief technology officers, chief data officers, CIOs, chief information officers. I can tell you that more than half of my meetings are now with CEOs. That's a huge change. And that's because CEOs are becoming very interested in data and what data can do for their enterprises. And as we discussed earlier, COVID has been a catalyst for this kind of thinking. Probably what's going to happen anyways, but so many things. COVID has been an accelerator of many things that were already happening, but now they're happening quicker.
Yeah, we've talked about this in a couple of our other podcasts, just the whole idea that companies are starting to see themselves as technology companies. And that has to be part of their expertise. And what made them realize it is when they started to realize the value of data. So that's the switch that makes a CEO realize that he can't just put technology off on the side and not think about it. He's got to engage.
Yeah, technology, obviously, all companies, I don't care what industry you're in, everybody is a technology company, whether we like it or not. It's being forced on us. We announced a very strategic relationship with BlackRock recently. And of course, BlackRock is by far the largest asset manager in the US or in the world for that matter, 22 trillion in assets that are being managed by hundreds of institutions. But aside from being an asset manager, they also have the industry's most prominent software platform for managing assets as well. So they are a full-on technology company in conjunction with also being a financial institution. They go hand in hand. So it won't be long before, in many conversations, we just can't separate the technology conversation anymore from the business conversation. Yeah.
BlackRock is so powerful, in fact, that it basically tells businesses, the business world, how it wants them to behave. You've probably seen some of the stuff where they said, hey, climate change is coming. We're going to invest in companies that deal with it, not that turn their faces away from it. So as you go higher and higher in these large organizations, you're going to be part of the conversation with the most powerful leaders in industry. And that should be interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the technology skills are becoming mainstream. They're not just for technical people. Everybody has to become technology savvy and conversant and all those kinds of things. And people have been trending that way, obviously. But it's accelerating everywhere.
Yeah. A lot of people are talking these days about the value of sharing data. I think people talk about it more these days because it's easier because of the cloud. It used to be one of the big bottlenecks. Sharing data internally and especially externally used to be just hard as could be. But the data cloud has changed that. So if you can talk about what are the most interesting things that your customers are doing internally and with their business partners or even with their customers, creating, I think what you've talked about is data network effects. What's going on there?
The reason that data sharing is such a big deal is because data science doesn't really care about the silos and boundaries between data. They're interested in data relationships, and they typically are discovered and they exist across data sets. So if you can't bring data together, you are not in a position to discover and really mobilize those relationships. So that's what's driving data sharing. We have to bring data together. That is just a big shift from where we historically have been, where we just did analytics inside a single silo. We called it a day, we populated the dashboard, and we went home at night. That's just not good enough. And data sharing was really hard historically because we either used APIs, which is like sucking data out through a straw, and it had all kinds of other management issues, latency issues, and cost issues, and so on, or we use massive heavy lifting through file transfer protocols. And that, of course, we had to surrender custody of the data, that all kinds of governance problems related to security and privacy. So after a while, we're like, this is just too hard. We're not going to do it anymore. What we're going to do as little as we possibly can. Because of the Snowflake data cloud, we can just now turn on data sharing relationships literally in minutes. We've shown that as part of Operation Warp Speed in terms of managing vaccine data out there, how important it was to create visibility across the supply chain, because data starts to make sense when you can see the entire supply chain as opposed to just one piece of it. It's like you have a flashlight and you're walking into a dark cave. Wherever you shine it, you have perfect visibility, but what you need to do is light up the whole cave. And now you really get the overview of what's going on, right? And there's also this delay of data problem that people need to get data much faster, or they simply can't act as an organization on what's going on. Now, the idea of data network effects is really important because once you're on a data cloud, you have access through the data cloud to external data, and you provide access to other parties to your data. You're now engaged in all kinds of data networking relationships with other parties. It's sort of like being on Facebook all over again, but now with your data. The relationships really become the fabric of your data operations. It's pretty hard to tear yourself away, but you become more and more heavily invested in building more of these data networking relationships. We now visualize our data cloud, and it looks like one of those Star Trek Death Stars out there, because it's just a massive networking constellation representation and visualization of what's going on. And you can drill down by industry, and you can drill down by individual institutions. You can take any flavor you want from it. But it really starts to hit on that data networking is a huge, huge thing, and it's growing in leaps and bounds. And of course, that's what Snowflake is. We're fanning those flames as hard and as fast as we know how, and we do that in any number of ways.
Yeah, that is really interesting. You kind of set off a light bulb in my head. As Snowflake's data cloud gets bigger and bigger, and it pokes into more industries, into smaller companies, big companies, you're essentially going to have a map of the business world, a schema that is visualized that you can use to, and other people who are members of the data cloud can use to figure out what the heck is going on in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. We always try to show prospects and customers, look, this is what your data cloud could look like. Forget about the Snowflake data cloud. It's ginormous. It has many players, but your version of the data cloud, what are your data networking relationship? How do you consume data? How do you provide data? And first of all, people have sometimes a hard time articulating that or really giving good guidance on that. But when they start thinking about it, all of a sudden, all the ideas start coming. We could do this, we could do that. So it's a very organic thing that just after a while, it starts to feed on itself. And sometimes it just feeds on itself because of the presence of partnerships and data that they can get access to that they never realized that they could, right? It's very important for us to prime that pump, right? To really make it rich and available, and then people's imagination takes them from there.
Right. Now, you've got the Snowflake Data Marketplace, and you've got the private exchange capabilities platforms. Have you seen any of your big enterprise customers put the whole thing out there, their entire supply chain, all those relationships, their entire distribution chain, or maybe even their marketing relationships? Are they really putting the whole network out there?
Now, people typically don't approach this with a giant scope and a giant switch. It is much more organic and piecemeal. A lot of data sharing relationships are one-on-one instead of one-on-many. But it's very dynamic. If you look day to day, week to week, month to month, things changing so rapidly, and the reason is it's really easy to do. Setting up data sharing relationships is a matter of minutes, right? You externalize the data in terms of the access. We develop the credentials for it, and there it is. Boom, you're off to the races, right? So there's really nothing. This was the problem historically with APIs and file transfers. It was just a horrendous undertaking to do the simplest things, and now it's just so easy that you can turn it on and off at will.
But in the future, you anticipate the companies will kind of create these meshes, of all of their relationships? Is that a possibility?
Absolutely. That's really the whole notion of having your own data cloud. Grab any large multinational global entity. What does their data cloud look like, right? What are their important data relationships that they're maintaining? And in large institutions, they have multiple divisions, multiple businesses. We see their data cloud then breaking down in data clouds for different businesses, right? So it has many different layers to it. It's just not one thing. And you can navigate it to your heart's content. You can follow all these relationships. But at the heart of the data cloud are data relationships. It's a consumer and a provider. And that's really the building block of the data cloud. And there's just a gazillion of those.
Yeah. It seems like market analysts have been talking for decades even about companies being able to monetize their own data. But it seems like the Snowflake Data Marketplace is really opening the floodgates for that kind of activity. If you could talk about some of these new revenue streams that companies are developing on the marketplaces, I think that would be interesting to people.
Yeah, the data marketplace so far has been a vehicle for people to really discover and explore and test all kinds of different data, and it's been very successful. But the monetization has been what we call out of band. That happens through a separate set of conversations, and especially for professional data providers, people that sell data for a living, and they obviously have business models, they have conduits, they have contracts, and they have models of what the currency is and how they price it and so on, which is all fine, but we are moving towards, and we are literally in the middle of developing this towards, a series of monetization models for people that are on our Snowflake data marketplace, so they can transact in band instead of out of band. We've signed up a bunch of what we call design partners, people that can really help us do this correctly for their type of business. There will not be one model. And one thing about data is that it's not all created equal, and so it's actually not a trivial thing. But we think if we do this and we do this correctly, I think it will unleash a whole new data economy, if you will, a whole new data industry, because it becomes so effortless now to transact on data, which historically has been incredibly hard, not just because of the physical movement and the custody of the data, but also about how do you buy this? How do you pay for that? All those questions. So the more it becomes like an Apple App Store in many ways, right? We're obviously used to that metaphor, and we use that example a lot because they did it incredibly well. The monetization model is incredibly well established, but the distribution model or the operational model is incredibly well established. They behave really well. They use all the common services. So there's a lot of sort of analogs and corollaries that are useful for us to examine.
Yeah, I get that. That'll make it much more efficient. But are you seeing any companies that kind of they're not data companies, but they're companies that are figuring out how to monetize their data because they've now organized it and managed it, and they have these sharing capabilities? Is that starting to happen too, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. Our whole industry, so where people scratching their head, and they know their data is valuable, but they never knew how to even have the first conversation around monetization. And we know people that own tens of billions of dollars in terms of fast food industry data because they run the restaurants. Geez, what is that data worth? In retail, they are incredibly rich in data. Well, what is that worth? Obviously, in banking, they know their data. If you run a card business, whether you are JP Morgan or you're Discover or Capital One, who is a big Snowflake customer, obviously they know they have extraordinarily valuable data. Sometimes they're interested in monetization. Sometimes data gets leveraged for advertising purposes. So there's other models in play as well. It's not always strictly data either. So yes, data monetization, it can become a whole new line of business for industries that have not existed before, because the platforms and the infrastructure just didn't exist. It was just too hard.
Right. Frank, I've heard you talk about the fact that not all data is created equal. What do you mean by that exactly? And how does the data cloud help separate the wheat from the chaff?
I'll give you an example. You look on our Snowflake data marketplace, one data set. I mean, we're listing almost 400 data listings right now, which is quite a lot. But there's one that stands out head and shoulders, and that happens to be a data set from Star Schema. It's very detailed, near real-time incident fatality data on COVID. Almost everybody in our customer base uses that data. That's what I mean by some data sets are incredibly impactful, very globally applicable, and everybody uses them. And then others are much more incidental, industry specific, or even specific to just one institution. Having the data size, the data sources that are incredibly impactful and globally applicable is a huge deal. We can spend all day loading our data cloud with data, and not move the dial. And you can find just one, and that completely changes things. We also see institutions coming together and combining data and creating new data products, which is a very interesting phenomenon also, because people then don't have to join the data themselves. They basically can access the data, and it's already joined and overlaid and blended. We're going to see all kinds of things that we may not have foreseen when we first got started on this journey, just because it's possible.
It's interesting. It's like the oil industry. You sell crude oil, and then somebody comes along and refines it into gasoline or jet fuel, and then somebody else uses the same stuff and makes it into plastic or something else. But that same thing is happening in the data world.
Yeah, we actually have even much more profound examples of that, because we have this whole notion of data services, or what our technical people refer to as installable applications, where we're really combining code with data. What that does is then data exists at multiple levels. It exists in a raw form, and then it exists in successive levels of value-added processing. And this is how software developers can really add value to data, make the data much more useful, impactful, valuable to potential consumers. And an example of that is say I have an MRI scan, which is an unstructured document, obviously today, that just gets sent to a radiologist and they read it and they basically, however they evaluate it and write that up. But suppose a bunch of software developers take that raw MRI scan, can compare that scan against industry data, historical data, other patient data, combine it with genomic data, clinical data, demographic data, however you want to go at this, and basically read that scan, but give a much richer, comprehensive analysis of that scan than the radiologist could ever come up with on her own. That's value-added processing. It's very precise value-added processing. That would be incredibly valuable, wouldn't it? And we think we're going to unleash an entire software industry around people that have specific expertise around specific data that can bring a higher level of value to these different data sources. And because you have a marketplace where people can A, discover the service, and B, monetize the service, it can really be fueled in terms of it lowers the bar for people to build things and market things and sell things, as well as transact. Yeah.
Do you foresee a time when the data marketplace actually has some of those solutions providers cataloged on it as well, in addition to the data providers?
Yeah, this is on its way. I will tell you that in the middle of this year when we do our big summit event, where we're going to show some of the leading edge examples, a lot of our connector technology that's built by us as well as by partners. We're going to use these models to do exactly that. So we're excited about where this can all go. So it's not just data, right? You got to think about data in a much bigger context than just raw data. Right? Because if I can bring value, incremental processing to the data, that starts to become really interesting, because as a customer, I now don't have to do that. I don't have to be smart. You get to be smart for me. I'm just using your service, and I'm producing the results of your service. I'm consuming the results of your service. And instead of me having to do that, so you have these subsequent levels of value brought to the data, and having a good marketplace and model around it. Software development has always been hard, because where does the data come from, right? Who wants to develop on dummy data? You really got to be very intimate to your understanding of the data to do something useful with it, right? Well, this is the opportunity.
Yeah. Hey, that leads right into my next question, which is, it seems like one of the most powerful aspects of the data cloud is how it democratizes data and data analytics, and puts all that power in the hands of the real users, the business users. And you're giving people throughout organizations, whether it be a line manager all the way up to the CEO and the C-suite, you're giving them the tools to do the kind of sophisticated analytics that in the past only a data scientist could manage. How is this changing organizations?
Well, it allows organizations to become data-driven versus data-informed. We spoke earlier about the fact that in the last century, we were running reports and we're populating dashboards. That's being data-informed, right? Basically, data goes to people, and then we hope like hell that people do something useful with it. When you go to data-driven, it's end-to-end programmatic and digital, right? It's real-time, it's highly scaled, it's economical, and it's incredibly precise in terms of its predictive ability. And that's really what modern enterprises are going to be made up of. They are just a series of digital processes, and the people working in enterprises are the people that built these processes and support them, resource and provision them, and so on. But fundamentally, the business process becomes end-to-end to digital. It all starts with blowing up these silos that we have built over decades. My biggest caution to customers is don't build the silos of the future. Don't steer the ship by its way. Think data cloud, allow the data to come together. Because if you don't, we're going to be very happy when we wake up some years into the future.
We'll have to tear down those silos again. That's right. Hey, I don't want to get too far down into the weeds with technology in this conversation, but I think it's important to talk about Snowpark. And I understand this is a new capability in your data cloud that enables developers to write code in their language of choice for data integration, data analytics, all those kinds of things. Now, Snowflake started off with a real focus on SQL as its native language. very popular, easy to use, all that kind of stuff. So why are you making this shift, and why is it a significant change for Snowflake and for the users?
Yeah, it's not so much a shift as it is an evolution and an expansion of our scope. You're absolutely correct. SQL is the great common denominator, because almost anybody that's been around data has some level of proficiency, and we've seen that, right? Snowflake has been able to address the largest data estates in the world, but also the smallest, where you have one person with a handful of files ingesting data and running queries in a matter of minutes. So that's been great, but there is another audience, and that audience are actually developers. These are highly technical people, and they want to manipulate data inside their preferred programming and scripting languages. There is a whole audience for that, because that's really where the whole Hadoop crowd and the people that came from that whole big data era, where they came from, that's how they grew up. And sort of they are evolving forward to this model. They are going to be using Java and Python and other languages to manipulate data. And there's lots of artifacts in the language itself that are there for data manipulation. So we feel that as a data platform, as a data cloud, we absolutely positively have to enable that. So what Snowpark really is a strategy for the language runtimes to be inside our platforms. And that really combines code with data. So in other words, it's not just a data platform, it's the combination of code and data on a single platform. And it really turns it into an applications platform rather than just a data platform. So, back to the earlier conversation about higher levels of value-added processing against data. This is very significant because our whole spectrum of workloads expands as a function of this. It's not the masses. It's certainly a smaller audience, but it's a very impactful and important audience. Very important, very meaningful, not just to address those workloads, but the combination of code and data really changes the texture of the data cloud to be a much bigger thing, because we're not just going to be circulating data there. We're going to be circulating data applications there. And that's obviously a huge universe. Yeah,
that's great. No, we've been, over the past year, it seems like the year that's lasted forever. We've been dealing with the pandemic, the economic crisis in the US and around the world. It seems like these things are on the path to lifting, though you don't want to jinx yourself. So how has Snowflake been using data to operate in the midst of these uncertainties and keep your rapid growth going in spite of uncertain times?
We're a Snowflake on Snowflake company. Our CIO, Sunny Beatty, he has a whole presentation, and we put him in front of customers all the time to talk about Snowflake runs on Snowflake. Because all the data that comes from operational environments, whether it's Salesforce or our own systems, it moves into our own internal Snowflake system, and it's heavily analyzed nonstop. I spoke earlier about how we guide Wall Street and the financial markets. All that happens in there. Obviously, when you run a consumption model, the analysis part of our business is huge, but our marketing people use it. Every part, our financial people use it, our sales operations people use it. There's not a single part. Of course, the engineering folks are all over this data. They actually support the platform. We have data at our core. We are a Snowflake-centric enterprise in every way you can imagine. It's just a natural reflex for us. So it's not like we really had to force ourselves down that path. So.
Yeah. I want to drill deeper, though. I want to understand how you and your management team use data to make decisions every day. You've got these huge challenges of volatility, of being a rapidly growing company, all the uncertainties, the situation. How do you use data to help overcome those things?
That depends on which part of the company you're talking about. The finance organization obviously is obsessed with understanding the consumption of our service will translate into costs and revenue and all these kinds of things, so that we can guide ourselves as well as external parties. And that's a very significant thing. So for a sales organization, they need to forecast their business based on what we're able to discern from the data. Our marketing organizations have a huge demand capability, and that is incredibly data-driven, because obviously we're constantly enriching our data, and all our targeting and our marketing operations are informed and driven, by what we discern from the data. Our engineering people, that's a whole universe unto itself because we are a service, not a software product, but we are a software service. I mean, we're now processing close to 1 billion queries a day, right? You can just imagine how much data we have about our service. And then it's across different cloud regions, and we have different operational load factors, performance. There's just an enormous amount of data. And by the way, that's growing 100% year on year. So, we're taking on Google-esque, type scale here in terms of the number of queries that we are processing in the next couple of years. So it touches every part of our business. There's sort of not one silver bullet here that we can point to that is the sheer magic. It just permeates itself through every function that we run.
Yeah, I get it.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Really need to dig deep and get to know the real you.
Seeing them real up close and personal.
I talked before about how you and I did the first podcast about a year ago. We've changed the format just a little bit. And right at the end, we'd like to ask a personal question, a little friendlier and softer. Now, I know about your racing boat. We talked about that. I think most people know about that. I'm told that you also have some pretty cool dogs, including a brand new one who I think we've been hearing bark in the background a little bit. So your work life is pretty intense. Do the dogs help you unwind, or how do they add to your life?
Yeah, I should say we, because my wife and I are both into this. So we're big animal welfare people. A lot of our charitable operations are both for domestic animals. We've built shelters in different places to really help different areas of the country become no-kill zones for animals and things of that sort. And so we do a lot of that kind of work. We also do habitat for wild animals. So that's been a focus for our charitable activities. And number one, we have a lot of affinity with it because we just like animals. But secondly, it's also something that the government does not fund at all. So it all has to come from private sources. So, might as well be people like us. In terms of our own animals, one of them is the 1-year-old big golden retriever. He's like 80 pounds, big fur ball. And the other one is an 8-month-old female black lap, and they're best pals, running around like crazy. I always say they humanize me, which might be necessary from time to time, but they're a great company to have. They go everywhere with us. We never leave them anywhere.
Well, Frank, it's been great talking to you. It really, talking again a year later like this really makes me realize how far things have come, certainly for Snowflake, but just the awareness of the data cloud, the importance of data, how aware people in business and in the media are of how important this is. And I feel like I got on the ground floor with you guys and I'm seeing something really grow big. So it's fun to watch from a bit of a distance here. So congratulations on this.
Yeah, thanks for your kind comments, Steve. I enjoyed our session here.
This episode is brought to you by Snowflake, the data cloud company. Inside the data cloud, organizations unite their siloed data, discover and securely share data, and execute diverse analytic workloads across multiple clouds. Learn more at snowflake.com/podcast.